Mr. President, the Russian Federation voted against the draft tabled by Bahrain, Jordan, Qatar, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. The draft resolution relating to the situation in the Strait of Hormuz and the adjacent waters. The position of our country regarding the present-day crisis in the Middle East is principled, consistent, and objective in nature. We condemn the United States and Israel's aggression against Iran. We respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries in the region, both the Islamic Republic of Iran and other countries of the Persian Gulf. We reject strikes targeting their civilians and their civilian infrastructure and view this as unacceptable. The Russian Federation undertook and continues to undertake efforts, including at the highest levels, to end such actions. We are striving to achieve a prompt establishment of peace in the Persian Gulf and in the Middle East. However, the Russian Federation was not able to support a text that would generate a dangerous precedent for international law of the sea, for any international efforts at peace, as well as for the authority of the Security Council of the United Nations. Back when Security Council Resolution 2817 was being negotiated, we called upon all Council colleagues to adopt a balanced and an objective approach similar. Equitable messages have already been repeatedly broadcasted by the Secretary General of the United Nations, calling upon the United States and Israel to end the war and calling upon Iran to cease attacks on its neighbors. Disregard for the root causes of the crisis in the Middle East, namely the illegal and reckless acts by the U.S. and Israel targeting Iran, is not possible and not acceptable. Our and the Secretary General's calls fell on deaf ears then. Nevertheless, we understand the situation of the countries of the GCC and Jordan, and therefore we abstained during the vote on Resolution 2817. This was not an easy choice for us. However, this time, our partners from Bahrain and their like-minded partners went much further, having tabled a fundamentally erroneous and dangerous approach to the situation in the region. Essentially, nearly each paragraph of the draft they proposed abounded with unbalanced, inaccurate, and confrontational elements. And we will point to just the main points in this regard. In paragraph 1 of the preamble and paragraph 6 of the operative part, Iran's actions were presented as the sole source for the so-called destabilizing activities and regional tensions. When it comes to the real causes for the current crisis in the Middle East, namely the U.S. and Israel's illegal attacks targeting Iranian soil, this was something which was not mentioned at all. And this, despite the fact that in paragraph 3 of the preambular part, the sponsors themselves highlighted that threats to maritime navigation in the Strait of Hormuz began to emerge precisely on 28 February 2026. This, incidentally, flew in the face of their own statements that the current initiative was designed to become a response to certain decades of threats to freedom of navigation by Iran. In paragraph 6 of the preamble, attempts to interfere with international navigation of the Gulf of Strait of Hormuz were categorically portrayed as threats to international peace and security. There was deliberate disregard for the fact that a significant part of the Strait of Hormuz is within Iran's territorial waters, and this was deliberately overlooked. Turning to paragraph 7 of the preamble, threats on merchant and commercial vessels and interference on freedom of navigation was identified as the sole reason for disruption to global energy supplies. Once again, without noting the root causes of the crisis, which was frankly mentioned by the President of the U.S. himself, publicly recognizing that an end to hostilities would result in the opening of the Strait of Hormuz. Turning to paragraph 9 of the preamble, as well as paragraphs 1 and 4 of the operative part, there were references to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, dating 1982. This international legal instrument does not apply to circumstances of armed conflict, which we stated on a number of occasions during the negotiations process. Paragraph 10 of the preamble noted that the source of threats to international peace and security in the context of the current crisis allegedly is Iran. Deletion from this paragraph of the reference to paragraph 7 to chapter 7 of the Charter was not a panacea. Such language essentially in any event can be interpreted by states acting in bad faith as legitimizing the use of force. Paragraph 2 of the operative part speaks for itself. It proposes that the Security Council give a green light for the use of certain protective measures, the scope and breadth of which is unclear to us under the pretext of ensuring safety and security of navigation without any consideration for the sovereignty of littoral states. The qualification about the purely defensive nature of these efforts essentially does not change the situation, especially given the fact that the sponsors themselves made clear that this was referring precisely to offensive measures, which was starkly seen in the language of paragraph 3 of the operative part, which emphasizes that states acting in accordance with paragraph 2 need to act in full compliance with international humanitarian law. In paragraph 7 of the operative part, notes that the Security Council would stand ready to consider further measures against those who undermine navigational rights and freedoms. This is an obvious hint at attempts to leverage sanctions pressure, irrespective of whether this is explicitly stated here or not. Turning to paragraph 7 and 8, not only this refer to the Strait of Hormuz, but also Bab el-Mandeb. So the sponsors deliberately expanded the geographical scope of their draft, thereby giving even greater grounds for expansive interpretation thereof. Turning to paragraph 9 of the operative part, despite the correct reference calls for diplomacy, this referred exclusively to de-escalation of hostilities in the Persian and Oman Gulf regions, as well as the Strait of Hormuz. When it comes to the need to cease the U.S.-Israeli aggression, this was swept under the rug. No mention was made. One thing is clear, Mr. President, regardless of attempts by the sponsors to make the text general in terms of the language, the essence thereof remained unchanged, and namely granting carte blanche for the continued aggressive acts and ongoing further escalation. What this would imply from the legal standpoint, as well as the implications for the situation on the ground, is clear to us, especially at a time when we hear statements from the U.S. president about the readiness to destroy Iran if the Strait of Hormuz is not opened. Once again, it behooves us to remind the Council members about the distortion of the Resolution 1973, adopted by the Council in 2011 on Libya, and what the loose and expansive interpretation thereof caused. The limit of trust in states which advance offensive measures under noble pretexts and streamlined language was exhausted then. We have already seen how the United States strove to justify their strikes against Iran with the right to defense in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter, generating a preventive interpretation thereof. We stand in solidarity with our Arab states who were implicated by Washington, who were victimized by the tragedy in the region. And despite that solidarity, we cannot but note that attempts to impose the rules of the game in the Strait of Hormuz plays into the hands of those who wish to further undermine security and stability in the Middle East and beyond. The protective measures to protect vessels, like any other property of member states, of the United Nations does not require Security Council resolutions. So it's sufficient to have references to Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, which grants the right to self-defense virtually under any circumstances. The spread of operations for security purposes in the Strait of Hormuz without the consent of littoral states is yet another reason for which we were unable to accept and to adopt vote in favor of the draft payable by Bahrain. Colleagues, the adoption of this kind of a document, which disregards the broad context of the situation, would further antagonize Iran, which was already enduring the daily U.S.-Israeli strikes. On the country's territory, vast numbers of civilians are perishing. There are now nearly 2,000 of such civilians who have died, 1/4 of whom are women and girls. The supreme leader has been killed, and as have many of the country's leadership. Civilian infrastructure is being attacked, including schools, hospitals, universities, energy, nuclear facilities, including the Bushehr power plant. And this is liable to morph into catastrophic humanitarian repercussions for Iran and for the entire region. We wish to underscore that the Security Council did not agree to a single line with an assessment of these violations of international law.
No excuses you will hear from us today, Ambassador Waltz.
I will not dwell in detail on the egregious double standards of this approach. However, this was carried out in a completely illogical manner, even from the standpoint of simple pragmatism. The adoption of such a one-sided resolution would undermine any prospect for the resumption of negotiations for the purposes of resolving the crisis, and would also obstruct important and useful peace initiatives which are currently underway by a number of states, including China, Pakistan, and Turkey. If the Security Council were to adopt a position that was imposed upon it, then there would be no incentive whatsoever for Tehran to engage in contact in any form with Washington, Washington, which twice already betrayed diplomacy. This was in June of 2025 and February of 2026. And as the U.S. began to conduct large-scale strikes against Iran at the height of the negotiations process. Mr. President, from the very start of work on the document, together with our Chinese colleagues, we conveyed to the Bahraini authors and other members of the Security Council our very serious concerns in connection with this initiative. We did not see room for revision of the text, which is why we urged our Arab friends to abstain from advancement thereof. However, our views were not heeded, and the draft was put to the vote. In any event, under these circumstances, we had no choice other than to vote against it. Russia consistently supports comprehensive security for maritime navigation in all international waterways, the opening of corridors for Venezuela and Cuba, an end to attacks targeting commercial vessels of any country. Similarly, we advocate unhampered navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. However, the only way to resolve this situation was with the participation of all littoral states bordering this important transport corridor. It is not possible to do this without Iran. We call upon our Arab and Iranian friends to resolve the issue of navigation and the movement of vessels directly. We stand ready to facilitate such contacts. Mr. President, we understand the concerns of our Arab partners vis-à-vis the question of freedom of navigation. And we, together with China, are proposing an alternative draft resolution on the current situation in the Middle East, including in terms of maritime safety and security. We are confident that providing for genuine freedom of navigation in the strait, which is of such critical importance for countries in the region and the entire world, the only way to achieve this is through a cessation of hostilities and through achievement of a negotiated solution. Our draft will be concise and equitable and balanced in accordance with the principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations, specifically regarding peaceful dispute resolution. In this connection, we are putting this straight away to in blue, and we will report on plans for voting shortly, and we trust that the membership of the Security Council will provide their support. Thank you.